Hello there.
I think we're live.
Good God.
Oh
I'm
my. Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Wojtunik. I'm representing the Canadian Society of Cinematographers today. My guest is Mr. Jay Holben. Jay Holben is an independent producer and director based out of Los Angeles, California. He most notably and recently he directed a feature film called Before the Dawn. He is the author of 2 books on cinematography titled Behind the Lens: Dispatches of Cinematographic Trenches and A Shot in the Dark, a creative DIY guide to digital video lighting on an almost no budget. If that wasn't enough, he's currently also a contributing editor to the American Society of Cinematographers. He's a faculty member for the Global Cinematography Institute, or GCI. He's currently in prep for another feature film, and if that wasn't enough, he's in the middle and trenches of writing the CineLens manual, which I'm told is up to 1,200 plus pages that should be coming out at the end of the year with cohort and co-partner Christopher Probst. In addition to that, I believe he's looking at world peace and cold fusion as a sort of side project. Jay, welcome. I don't know where you find the time.
Thank you. Wow, that was kind of nice. Thanks for leading with the director producer. Most people forget to talk about that, so I appreciate it.
Of course.
It's good to see you. Nice to join you here in the morning.
Thank you. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to literally just milk as much information as I can from you, optics-wise, maybe garnish some insights on this sort of tone that you're writing by the end of, is it still the end of this year? I hear,
yeah.
Is that absolutely a promise that it's fantastic? I mean, I want to kick us off or start us off with really just, I'll just, selfishly ask with something that I'm very fascinated in. In the last 5-10 years, there's been this sort of surge or uptake in smaller, lesser known or boutique kind of agencies creating their own optics. And I kind of wanted to get your opinion as to why that is in the market today.
Blame it on red.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. That's all the time that we have today. That was Jay Holben.
Actually, that was somewhat sarcastic, but that was really kind of the start of it. So what happened was, the Red Digital Cinema introduced the Red 1, which really democratized the idea of owning a higher end PL mount camera. So we went from $150,000, $250,000 as a degree of entry to own a motion picture camera to $60,000, and that exploded the market of all of the availability of these cameras that suddenly needed lenses, and that pushed the demand on the marketplace. I mean, these major lens manufacturers went from a couple of hundred clients around the world to thousands of clients around the world. And it really, really pushed demand. At the same time, computer software like ZMax helped to democratize lens design. 3D printing helped to speed up the process of prototyping. So it went from where it would take years to ray trace a particular lens design and to figure out that design before it went into prototyping. You're not talking about weeks. So all of these things kind of came to a head and made things like the Atlas Orions possible. I remember being at NAB and hearing about these brand new anamorphics, that kind of came out, and I was curious, and we went and looked at it, and we just said, this is BS. There's no way that this company just came up with these. This is not possible. But all of these factors came into play, and they absolutely did come up with them, and they're beautiful, and at the price point that they hit.
Yeah.
So that's part of what's happening with all of these other smaller companies that are popping up, is that there's more and more demand. There's more and more interest in lenses. There's more and more owner operators. So more and more companies are popping up and reducing that price point, that price to entry.
Do you think that saturating the market like this is sort of forcing the bigger guys to kind of reinvent themselves, or are they sort of just wanting to stay true to what they've been doing?
Oh, absolutely. It's forcing them to reinvent themselves. They're running scared. When you talk about the Cooks and the Zeiss and the Panavisions and the Leicas of the world, they ran the monopoly, really, especially Cook and Zeiss. And now they're realizing, whoa, we have to turn around and capture an entirely different market. Just looking at Zeiss alone, one of the most successful products in optics they ever put out were the CP2s. CP2s outsold anything that they had ever put out in the cine world. So they realized, whoa, we can't just cater to the high-end market anymore. Our real bread and butter now is in kind of getting new people into this. So yeah, all of the bigger companies have had to, well, except maybe Panavision, have had to change their game and cater to the smaller end. You've got like a Sumalux and you got the Summicrons, and you've got the Zeiss Supremes and you've got the CP3s. Cook hasn't really jumped into that lower end of marketplace yet, but everybody else is scrambling to kind of get there.
I mean, this might be a little bit of a weird question, but do you think that that's, I don't want to say a good idea or bad idea, but is what Cook is doing something wrong, in the sense that, like even Panavision being a legacy brand, do they have to kind of try and compete, knowing the sort of the history that they have in the sort of the pantheon of like the cinematic world?
What Panavision's done to compete is to make sure that they have positioned themselves to be the catering high end. So Panavision is really well known, and they have kind of established the whole concept of tuning lenses, right? That's you as a cinematographer. What do you want? We will get you exactly what you want, and we'll make these lenses work for you. And that's the way that they're sort of keeping their foothold. Plus, the massive wealth of lenses that they own. I mean, it's overwhelming. You try to look at like a Panavision website, it's not even the tip of the iceberg of what they actually have. It's so frustrating to try to catalog their glass, because it's just phenomenal what they own. But is Cook doing something wrong by not catering to the smaller market? No, but they're definitely missing out on a larger portion. They're trying to maintain that we are Cook lenses, but with the exception of maybe the S4 minis, they're not really touching into that larger marketplace that they could tap into.
Jesus, like you're segue king, and that's sort of 3 questions that I have next, but it's just like I want to take it back a little bit in terms of it. And I've heard you speak to this before, which was the driving force for the better part of the century for optics has been sort of remove everything, remove CA, remove imperfections, remove aberrations, up until like 97 or Christ, like, high 90s, if not early 2000s. And now, and again, this might be a little bit more of a 2-parter, but obviously we know that kind of the imperfections that are being put into new lenses now, and sort of putting in a prescription, so to speak, to give something some characteristics to make it interesting to shoot on digital. I guess my question would be, and I want to bring it back to the answer that I've heard you say before once was there's a misconception between resolution and sharpness. And I want you to expand on that a little bit with maybe how the market is being driven with making these kind of lenses that embrace funky characteristics.
Ooh, that was a pivot. My brain was working on the one question, and but I got you on that. Yeah, really, sharpness, which is a term that a lot of cinematographers use, is made up of multiple aspects, and the 2 primary aspects of sharpness are resolution, which is the ability of the lens to resolve fine detail, and contrast, which is the ability of the lens to resolve high contrast lines. They're really, really close related, but they're separate ideas. And you can have a lens with high resolution and low contrast, and you can have a lens with high contrast and low resolution. So these are kind of competing ideas, and the two of them together are what create sharpness. So a lot of people equate sharpness with contrast. And that is something that has been kind of pulled away from, as like you said, coming up in the late 90s, we're starting to get more character into lenses. We're starting to get more flare induced in lenses where, basically from the 1880s up until the 1990s, the whole point of optical designers was we want more contrast, less flare, higher resolution. And that's what we're trying to do. And then suddenly, we get into the digital cinematography world, and people are discovering that we can really refine the image from the glass that we use, and we can create these beautiful characteristics. Cinematographers went, whoa, 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 wait a minute. No, we don't want this anymore. We want character. And lens designers said, what? I've actually seen them do exactly that, and it's terrifying. It's actually really funny to see an optical designer, an optical engineer be on a cinematographer's lens test. They'll be backed by the monitor going, oh, that lens is horrible. Look at that. There's so much chromatic aberration. There's distortion around it. There's way too much veiling glare. And the cinematographer's like, I love it. That's the one I want. And the lens designer is just cannot, they're astounded. They can't take it. But I'm deviating from your question, which is, there are different aspects of sharpness that define what we call sharp, and it's generally contrast and resolution. Also worked in there is acutance, which some people refer to as micro contrast. That's really kind of a hard thing to quantify, but it's differentiation of contrast in very, very fine detail. I may have gone too far in the nerdy.
No. This is great because it gives me time to sort of just like think of my next question, because it's just like you're just helping me buy my time.
I can start making things up too if you need.
Another segue that you had, which I want to go back to earlier in your previous question, which is you talked about briefly the prescriptions that Panavision was known for, about depending if you're a cinematographer doing like long format show or feature or something like that, or like a series, they were able to sort of like custom make a lens for you or lens set for you based on predicated on your kind of like desires, like to make it warmer or contrastier, less contrastier. I'm starting to see, and the world is starting to see a lot of manufacturers sort of like the Airy DNAs and even now the Ingenue Optimo Primes are coming up with this kind of workaround of being able to make your own prescription as you choose on the fly by attaching it to the rear element of it. And, in the sort of like the Tribe 7 lenses, they have 3 lens sets that have different prescriptions, like a heavy tuning, a light tuning, and then like a wild tuning that they have. Is there a benefit from like frontal projection, I guess, to rear projection, like in terms of like where you put that prescription?
Yes and no and yes. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve. Like I kind of said earlier, Panavision has really cornered the market on that, and not only that, but especially Dan Sasaki and Guy McVicker here in Los Angeles have devised a system where they actually have a menu that they can give you. You're like, what are you looking for out of this? And they know within these steps of this menu, you've got your noir and you've got your softness and their whole prescription, that they have very specific steps that they take to tune that lens that are completely reversible. So they can take a Primo, do 3 things to it, make it look exactly like you want. It goes out on your show, and then when it comes back, they can return it to factory. So none of these are, destructive changes, and none of these are permanent changes. But where those changes happen within the lens all depends on what you want to do. If you want more flare, that's generally better at the front of the lens than it is at the back of the lens. Just because generally speaking, you're getting a lot more light into the front of the lens than you are necessarily, bouncing around the back of the lens. You can still achieve some back there, but that front element and, decoding that or adding some texture to that, well, texture's not good on the front. That's, changing your coatings is really where you're going to start to get more flare. That texture in the back is like something that they did with the Sakuras. I think I'm pronouncing that right. NAC took ultra primes and basically built a diffusion filter onto the rear element. There's like little metallic flakes back there, and it creates a really interesting flare quality. I lost what your question was. I think I got it.
It was just more sort of like, I find it interesting that companies now are guiding themselves to not be locked in physically to one look anymore. And is that also like something smart, or is that kind of just like they should take a stance to kind of just do their own look, Well, like when was the last time that Ingenue made a prime lens? Like 1927? Like it was
50s.
Right.
The 1950s. And even Pierre Ingenue was instrumental in creating wide-angle lenses for reflex cameras, introducing the retrofocus or the inverted telephoto design concept, and that was really the 40s and 50s, if I'm remembering right. But yeah, they deviated and turned into the zoom world. Again, Pierre Ingenue really set the bar for what a motion picture zoom should be. And they stayed in that world for the longest time. It's kind of fun to see them come back into primes. But yeah, personally, the lens manufacturers have kind of been sitting down with me for a while and being like, what do you want? What's the next big thing? And I've been saying for quite a while, give me a lens that is tunable. I want another ring on the lens to change spherical aberration.
Oh,
I
interesting.
want to dial my spherical aberration on that lens.
Oh, interesting. You don't want to be confined to sort of just like the best prescription that a company could offer you. You want to go like prescription plus.
Yeah, because there are different scenes call for different looks, and even different setups within a scene. You can have, a lens that is tuned perfectly. It gives you the perfect veiling glare, and then suddenly you turn around and you've got a backlit situation, and it's too much. So you're scrambling to be like, oh my God, okay, I've got to change my lighting, or I've got to stop down now deeper than I wanted to, in order to change that quality. So to be able to back that off a little bit and reduce the halation or reduce the spherical aberration within the lens, and especially spherical aberration is not that hard to induce and control. So if we're talking about air gapping, an element within the central design, it's not that hard to put that into another mechanical ring. Now, I haven't seen anybody do that, but the optimal primes kind of come close to that idea by having, an element that we can swap out in the center plus the rear additional element.
Right. Also with this sort of surge of being able to sort of tune lenses with new manufacturers, there's been a huge pressure now with this large format craze, right? It's and companies are being forced to kind of readdress this the size issue that optics have, and like obviously some Super 35 lenses and traditional ones that we all know and love aren't able to cover that sensor. We all know this. This question has been around for some time. It's also something that Red had started long ago, just like releasing their APS-H sensors and things like that. The thing that I find fascinating though is like, it seems like everybody is trying to sort of plow themselves into this format when we know that there's another one that's just around the corner, like 65 mil. Does it make sense to kind of address this, knowing that there's a bigger beast, and like go for this sort of in between? Now I know it's not an in between format because the format has arguably existed, like time over. So I know this existed, so it's not something that we've just invented now. But that being said, it's just like, why not go for the bigger thing? Why not go for the 65 mil format that we know that exists in the sort of physical universe that we occupy?
In my opinion, that 65 is still going to exist at the really fringe higher level. And LF is something that is more achievable. Now, LF is also a bit of a misnomer because it's not large format. We're dealing with larger than Super 35, but large format is a still photography term. And there ain't nothing we've touched in motion pictures that comes close to large format still photography. So I kind of take umbrage with that term a little bit. Not with you. Aries the biggest offender there because they really ran with that large format concept. But anyway, what we're talking about is, the full frame or the equivalent of 135 in the still world, the 24 by 36 size imager. And that seems to be just this really nice realm for more people to get into that less depth of field. And honestly, that's all it does. That's the difference. Because it's changing that base focal length for what you are used to seeing. Meaning if you're normally shooting Super 35 and you shoot with a 50 millimeter lens, when you go to 24 by 36, that 50 millimeter lens is going to be wider than you're used to. So you're going to go with a longer lens, which at any given distance is going to give, and stop, will give you less depth of field. That's the difference.
It's interesting because it's just like, obviously, and again, this argument was had many times over, but it's by virtue of going to that format, you're losing this wonderful, again, this pantheon of legacy optics that, that have wonderful characteristics that you can't kind of put onto LF. Now they make expanders, but those expanders inherently kind of change the properties and characteristics of the lens. Can you touch upon, I've heard so many different people talking about this, including Matt Duclos. What is your take on using expanders on like sort of vintage glass on a large format camera? Again, your take, maybe not necessarily, I'm not looking for a scientific answer, for example, but it's just like, yeah, like your personal taste.
Personal taste, I would generally avoid it. Because like you said, you're changing the quality, you're also losing light. So you're fighting a lot of things when you introduce that. So I would, if I'm going into that larger world, I would generally go for a lens that naturally covers the larger sensor. Really, the only time that expanders kind of have a role is if you're married to a particular zoom. And for some reason, you want to stay with that particular zoom. You like the range, you like the speed, you like the functionality, the size, whatever it is. Then the expander kind of makes sense because now you've been adopted into the larger format. But for me personally, I would rather go for something that organically covers that. That's also something that magically Dan Sasaki is figuring out how to do, is altering lenses to expand their image circle without necessarily significant degradation to the image or even light loss. And they're very tight-lipped about exactly what they're doing, but he's making magic out there.
I feel like whenever I hear the name Dan Sasaki, I feel that they have him bunkered somewhere in like Woodland Hills, and then they're just sort of like feeding him eventually, and then it's just like, don't come out until you have the next idea. And then that's my imagination of Dan. I mean, we've talked about Dan Stock quite a bit. I mean, some of us know who he is, but why don't you tell us who Dan officially is, like in an official title?
Sure, I'm probably going to butcher it because it's a long title, but generally the vice president of optical engineering for Panavision, Woodland Hills, or their flagship California location.
I'll ask the first question here because we got the. I mean, we sort of were touching upon it, but I mean, again, this is a personal question. Vilkin is asking clean lenses versus lenses with character, and I guess. Why don't we answer both ways? What do you prefer? And I guess, what do you prefer?
I was going to have a snarky answer to that, and I'm not going to go snarky. The truth is that every lens has a job, and every lens has a role. If you're shooting, a commercial, and the client wants everything pristine and clean, then a lens with a lot of character is not what you go for. If you're trying to get product details, you don't want a lot of flare, you don't want loss of contrast or resolution. So that may be the job you pull out the master primes on. If it's more of a narrative and you're trying to get that more character into it, then yeah, you lean more into that. And that's really where my world mostly is. So generally, I love lenses with a lot of character. That's kind of my personal thing. I see these super clean, super sharp lenses, and it's like, okay, great. Nice to know that you're out there. Give me the flares. Give me the aberrations. I want to see that lens with chromatic aberration that looks like it's a double image, just to know that it's out there and that I could pull that out when I want to. I got introduced 2 years ago, I think, to the Deaconizer. The cinematographer that I work with, Katie Williams, had found this custom configuration that Roger Deakins did with Otto Nemens and Dan Lopez at Otto Nemens for the assassination of Jesse James. It's like a vintage Petzval lens from the 1800s. The edges of this is just mush, and you really only have any modicum of focus in the center, but they are beautiful. They're amazing. I just fell in love with this thing. It's limited application, but God, when you go to it, it's gorgeous. I started ripping it.
Do you, it's interesting because obviously that lens was created for a purpose, and now obviously it was used on a very different format many, many decades later. Do you like that? It's just, I don't even know if I want to ask that question, but it's like, I'll actually stray away from it.
I think I know where you were going there.
Fill me in. You know where I'm going.
If you're going into, do I like the fact that we're reaching for this older stuff and resurrecting it?
It's more kind of like, is there, I guess the question was, I will ask it, is there going to be a finite point, do you think, in imagers that the lens is going to be useful up until? Or is it just an infinity kind of like trajectory? This is more kind of like maybe more for like lens owners, this question, in terms of just like in terms of investing and what they go to and stuff like that. Like, it's just, there's so many things on the market and so many things are financially accessible now to kind of like users like myself. I mean, will there be a point where it just becomes not usable for future imagers?
More than likely, yes. Not necessarily, well, maybe future imagers, but also trends and fads. 10 years ago, you could buy K35s. See, I did it. I broke it. I said the word. It was my fault. But
you lost. It's a case of beer.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I totally did it. You could buy a set of K35s for 20 grand, 30 grand. They were like forgotten it and nobody wanted them. And then all of a sudden there's this uptick, and now it's almost $250,000 to buy a set. And that's just because that's a trend right now. Everybody's going for that glass. Everybody likes that particular glass. Every company's coming out with a new lens and saying it's K35 like. And now you see like ultra primes are hard to sell because they're a little too clean and they're a little too neutral. Actually, they're really beautiful, and I backpedaling on that a little bit. And anecdotally, the French Society of Cinematography, the AFC, did an intensive lens test, a really extraordinary blind lens test, where they tested 36 different lenses and then projected them in back-to-back iterations, and you rated them as you went, I like or too flary or whatever you did. And then at the end of the test, they revealed what everything was. And man, it was phenomenal what people picked. And I found one of the things that I leaned to in that test, which was really surprising to me, were ultra primes. I was like, I had forgotten that these things were out there. So you don't, dismiss things, but these trends happen. So it's really hard to say what's the best thing for ownership. There might be people that are out there scrambling to pay $200,000 for a pristine set of K35s, and it might be 10 years from now, nobody wants them anymore, and they're back selling for 50 grand or something. It's hard. It's like the stock market, really. There is a certain safety because glass will last. We are still working with lenses that were invented in the 30s, that were built in the 30s. It's harder and harder to work with things that get older than that, but it lasts. So, God, that was a terrible answer to the question.
No. I feel like this is great because I've redeemed myself from my terrible babbling earlier. So this is fantastic. But again, you're segueing beautifully, and we have questions that actually kind of are extensions of your answer that you can speak to a little bit, which is Adita is asking, in terms of aiming for clean clinical lenses, have the lens manufacturers done what they set out to do? Like, have they made that perfect clinical lens, or is there a ceiling? I know that both Fuji and Zeiss created those digiprimes that were like crazy sharp and they lasted for like 3 years. Now you can actually see them, and now you can actually see them on eBay for like a few $100 or whatever. But it's just has mankind reached that ceiling with like ostensibly the perfect lens?
Yes. Can they get more than that? It's highly possible, especially as we get into more freeform optical elements. The possibility of 3D printing, which is coming, it's already happening for eyeglasses. But the fact that we can 3D print lenses and make true freeform lenses, yes, there's a possibility that we can continue to improve sharpness, acutance, resolution, and continue to move that scale. It just isn't a trend to do that right now in motion pictures. Panavision sort of hit the pinnacle with the Primos. Arri and Zeiss hit the pinnacle with the Master Primes. Leica hit the pinnacle with the Summilux. And those are kind of the highest performance motion pictures. Zeiss also did it with the Milivis. I think it's kind of funny and somewhat ironic that when you look at like Panavision, the highest performance lenses they ever created were the digital Primos that were designed for 2/3 inch cameras, because as the imagers get smaller and smaller, the performance of the lens has to get better and better to resolve detail at that smaller size. So those lenses outperform Primos, but really they're completely gathering dust because nobody is reaching for those 2/3 inch sensors.
Right.
So the same thing with the digital, the digiprimes that you mentioned.
Recall one of this is many years ago now. This is, I think, when master anamorphics first came out. I remember I think Arri's trajectory with the master anamorphics was that they wanted to actually pair it with a digital camera, more for commercials than for long format or features or anything like that. They wanted to come out with an ecosystem where you had a lens, an optic, and a camera body, or like an imaging sensor, where you could just put them together and you could almost decide what you want to shoot with on the day. So it's like, does this call for anamorphic? Does this call for like, Super 35 image? And the lens would just perform technically perfect according with the camera. But again, like their pathway trajectory like sort of steered away with the Mira, and then they switched gears with LF coming out first before their full body camera and all that kind of stuff. Milvis are master primes, are they not? They're cut down master prime lenses, or am I giving away trade secrets that I shouldn't be giving away?
I actually don't know the answer on that. I have no idea if that is accurate or not. It seems in the timeline that they may have come before the master primes, but I'm not entirely sure. Once we get beyond cine lenses, my sphere of knowledge of still lenses dwindles very quickly.
Fair enough.
A very micro focus on cine. So I don't know the answer. I'm not hiding any trade secrets. I really don't know.
Another great question here from Joseph. What are your thoughts on still cinemodded lenses? I know that you just said that it's not your wheelhouse, but I guess mods, like ours and Zeiss contact lenses on modern digital sensors like the Mini LF, stuff that can cover full frame, but like mods.
Beautiful, stunning, amazing. I'll have to be a little semantical with what they mean by CineMod, because CineMod, it's actually kind of a trade name from Duclos. But when I think of CineMod, I think of we're taking a still lens, we're adding a gear to it, whether that just be a Delrin gear or zip tizer or whatever we're doing to that, and either changing out the mount or using an adapter to use that still lens, and that can still be clumsy. It's a band-aid. If we're talking about rehousing still glass to work in the cinema world, oh yeah, man, absolutely. There are some beautiful glass out there that's being adapted. And my co-author and kind of longtime friend and working partner, Christopher Gross, is just up to his eyeballs in that world of rehousing and finding glass. And he will buy up 30, 40 different 35 mil stills to try to see what matches within the set he's built best, and then bug the snot out of Alex Nelson over at Zero Optic to say, okay, I now have this Olympus, and rehouse this for me. Discovering these crazy lenses in the still world, these J.C. Penney and Sears lenses, and what was this glass, and what do these look like, and old Olympus and Pentax, and it's extraordinary what's out there and still available. And most of these were made for that 24 by 36 135 format, so they will cover a Mastro, they will cover an LF. And are really quite beautiful, especially when you get into, for me personally, into that 70s, 1960s, 70s glass. It's kind of a sweet spot between too much character and you're getting some character in speed, in kind of vintage coatings now.
My apprehension is when you're rehousing optics, I'm incredibly nervous that by virtue of you going to a place like, for example, like TLS or Zero Optics, how does that not inherently change some characteristics in the lenses? So it's like, let's say it's like I'm a kid, I have like ours, and it's just like I found my set, I matched the serials, I got it all. I bring it to one of those guys, and I say, please put these, cinemize them, give me the 300-degree focus barrel, how does that not inherently change any of the characteristics of those lenses?
Precision mechanics. It is the simple answer to that question.
Right.
In the case of, say, TLS, TLS will generally strip away the outer barrel, but will keep the inner lens cells. So generally within, and this isn't the case with everything, but generally within optical design, there are inner optical cells, which are, you imagine a metal barrel that is somewhat sealed, and there are multiple lens elements within that that have a fixed relationship to one another. So their distance to each other is set. They are secured within this cell, and this cell comes out as its own separate element. Call it a lens head or a optical cell, and then TLS will take that cell out with that mechanics and put it into a new housing, grab onto new mechanics, and operate that. Zero Optic takes a little bit of a different approach, and they strip away all mechanics. But they do that by just precision measuring, really to the micron level, of the position of these lenses and where they sit, and rebuilding a system so that it sits in the exact opposite prescription. And even when you do that, you can really optimize that original prescription. There's copy variants and things that happen over time. Things get loose, things get shifted. A seat starts to warp or fail because of different temperature cyclings over 20, 30 years, and that lens can actually reduce its performance from its original prescription. Somebody like Zero can take that and refine it and change the air gap of two elements to actually make that lens perform the way it's supposed to. It's really easy to see once you start putting components together when you get it wrong. It's very quick to see, okay, no, something's off. I've got a canted element or a tipped element, or I'm off in my air spacing, because the performance will degrade quickly. So reproducing the original performance, I'm not going to say it's not hard, but these companies have already kind of mastered that.
It's still fine. I still have a hard time thinking even just the coating, the anodized paint or something that's on the inside of some of these lenses. How do they even match that? Do you know what I mean? Do they have, you can't just go to a Color Your World or to Home Depot and match a color swatch to just be able to fill it out. I'm sure they're a little bit more precise than that, but it's interesting because it's just, other than those two companies, I feel like it could be a disastrous kind of effect. If they don't have that kind of precision, no? I mean, or something else beautiful might happen that you don't know, but.
Right, that's true. There's always that kind of surprise. There are certainly aspects of a fudge factor. When you're talking about the reflectivity of the internal barrel, there's a lot of room for fluctuation. If you're polishing the inside of the barrel and you're leaving it unanodized and you're not blacking, then that's going to change the quality of the flare drastically. But from one level of anodizing to another, or going from, say, aluminum to magnesium, is not necessarily going to change drastically or even notably the image quality. So there's a lot of wiggle room within that. What will do it is making sure that the edge blacking on the elements is the way it's supposed to be, because that will degrade and change the flare quality of the lens over the years. And just making sure that light baffles are properly installed, and mechanical vignetting is properly installed. I've seen a lot of rehoused lenses that unfortunately start to vignette too early because they're not really paying attention to the size of the exit pupil at the final mechanical element, or there's a baffle that's a little bit too small inside the lens, or the front edge is a little bit too long. So those kind of things can change and kind of have to be refined.
going along with this sort of new age conversation of just like people and the excitement of taking kind of all these older lenses and kind of remodifying them. This one's a little bit more specific question, but Charlie's asking, what's your opinion on the new age of where, specifically in this question, anamorphic lenses are going in terms of just like, because the properties that people are embracing about anamorphic is all those kind of gnarly imperfections, the stuff that was like really kind of grimy or gross, or like the quadrants are off, and it's just like you're able to kind of be able to do like just get some real great characteristics onto a sensor. Where is anamorphic going? And specifically, I guess, do you like the trend where sort of like now there's a new company called Zelmus or something like that, who's
I believe it's
Zelmus coming on the coattails of Atlas and stuff like that. Are these what is your take on those, like in terms of I guess building them from scratch, or are these are they built from scratch, or are they kind of taking older principles and rehousing them?
I'm not sure on the Zelmus. The Atlas, like I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, when I first saw those things, the whole conversation we had as we walked away was like, they're ripping this off. They're taking Shiga anamorphots and pulling them off in different scopes. They're doing something, because there's no way that they're creating these things new. And I was totally wrong. Forrest Schultz, who's the main optical designer behind the Atlas Orions, took a really smart and simple approach to a basic anamorphic optical design that just really works, and really refined the mechanical operation of those lenses, and made some really beautiful, incredibly well-priced lenses that I became a fan of. I haven't seen the Zelmus personally yet, so I don't know what they're doing, but the answer to in my opinion to that question is really the more the merrier. The more that we as filmmakers have options available to us, I think that's extraordinary. When I was a cinematographer, way back when in a previous life, I used to say former cinematographer, but Dave Stump corrects me, and I'm supposed to say I'm a recovering cinematographer. Anamorphic was this almost untouchable thing, because it was pretty much, there was across the ocean, there were French anamorphics and Russian anamorphics, and some Japanese anamorphics, but really here in Los Angeles there was Panavision, and maybe the Crystal Expresses. And every time you would go to Panavision and say, hey, I got a show coming up, I'd like to do anamorphic, sorry, they're out. No, sorry, no C-series. Because, the next Raiders of the Lost Ark movie has 6 cameras, and all the C-series anamorphics are off on that. So it was this kind of untouchable, intangible that I always just hungered to get on. I grew up in that format. Like, that's the bread and butter to me, watching films and falling in love with movies, is anamorphic. So that was always something that I reached for, but it seemed unattainable. Today, everybody can shoot, right? Because these choices are out there. It's not just C-series, E-series, G-series, and Panavisions, but you've got the Atlas, you've got the Zelmus, you've got the DZOs, you've got Crystal Expresses, you've got Lomos, you've got Kawas. What do you want? So I think it's extraordinary to have the choices, and are we saturating the market? Maybe a little bit, but also, we're also saturating the market with filmmakers. So as long as people are creating great material, then more power to them.
We started this conversation with like a little bit, it's going to get there, a slippery slope. And in this case, it's anamorphics, and maybe perhaps a shorter history than sphericals. But, I selfishly, because I know how much of a history buff you are, let's talk about it. Let's actually start and maybe give a little bit of a history to the people. Henri Chrétien makes the anamorphot, right? The first thing, and then take it away. Give me the give me the 2-minute history.
Oh my God. Well, I just got to say, just on kind of a personal anecdote, cool moment. Chris and I, for the book, we're at the ASC yesterday, shooting all of the ASC is their collection of lenses, and one of the things in their collection is an original Chrétien hypogonar anamorphic adapter.
Wow.
So just having my hands on that for a minute was a very cool thing. He was not the first to come up with the concept of optically squeezing. There were, and I'm sorry, forgive me, the names are not coming to me right now, but there were a couple of the concepts of utilizing cylindrical elements. What Chrétien, God, I hope I'm saying that right, wound up doing originally was to create optics for tanks in World War I to be able to get a wider field of view undistorted for the tank operator looking through a periscope. And thought, wow, wouldn't it be really interesting to do movies with this and to create a widescreen movie on a regular size negative, and tried to sell it to Hollywood. It came to Hollywood and everybody out here went, meh, we don't need it. And there were, a couple of films that were done in Europe with his hypogonar adapter, but for the most part, it was kind of forgotten until two things happened in the 1950s. The first, well, they're kind of simultaneous, so it's hard to say first, but one of them was the introduction of This Is Cinerama. And This Is Cinerama was a single camera with 3 strips of film and 3 lenses shooting simultaneously that was then projected on 3 projectors onto an ultra wide screen. And that film, This Is Cinerama, played to sold out crowds for over a year. And every studio paid attention to that. Simultaneous to that, we have thousands of theaters closing across the world, and especially in the United States, because of the ubiquity of television. Television is being introduced into the home. We're not in the greatest economic situation in the world, and people are not necessarily coming back to the movies. So Hollywood's running scared. And one of the things that happened was Earl Spotable and Spiro Sikora, again, I'm going to murder these names, of 20th Century Fox, or Earl Spotable knew about the hypergonar attachment. And he said, you know what, we have a way within one camera, within our current system, to create a widescreen movie. And they ran out to France to meet with Chrétien and found out that Warner Brothers had the rights to this. And their rights expired, like almost to the day that Spotable showed up in France and said, you know what, we want this, we're taking it, we got the rights to this right now. We got a movie that we're making called The Robe, and we're going to put this into production right now. And they came back to the US with a couple of these adapters, enough to basically make 2 lenses and put 2 productions into production simultaneously. There were bicycle messengers carrying these adapters between the 2 shows so that these shows could run simultaneously with basically one focal length. The Robe was basically shot with a 50 millimeter anamorphic, and that's it, because that's all they had. And that created this idea of widescreen anamorphic movies, and they introduced CinemaScope. This is 20th Century Fox. And Fox licensed this to all the other studios. Anybody who wants to use this, go right ahead. And they started making Bausch & Lomb here in the United States, started making projector elements and lenses, and this became that ubiquitous widescreen format. There's a lot of competing formats that came up in the 1950s, so VistaVision,
Technorama,
WarnerScope, Technorama, Technoscope. I mean, in the book, we have a list of probably close to 100 competing formats that came out about the 1950s.
These weren't the typical traditional like 2 times anamorphic that existed. These were all sort of predicated on the on Academy 35, right?
Correct. The anamorphic format was designed to fit within the Academy frame. And even in the variations of anamorphic, it's still to this day in a 1.19, 1.91, 1.971, sorry. Took me a second to figure that out. Aspect ratio. It doesn't utilize the full frame. When you try to do a 2x squeeze on the full, even Super 35 perf to perf, you wind up with too wide of an image that isn't necessarily projected. And there were definitely wider formats that were tried in the 1950s, but what they found was that the theaters physically couldn't project wider images. They didn't have the screens. So either the image had to get too small in order to project wide, or they just couldn't do it. They're like, our theaters aren't this big. So we settled in this originally 2.35 to 1, and then that changed in 1970 to 2.39 to 1. But yeah, there was a lot of formats that came from 2perf 35, the Technoscope format that is not anamorphic but gives you a 235 naturally by only using 2 perforations. There's the VistaVision, which turns the film sideways and gives you that 135 8perf format that does a natural 185, and you can compress or you can crop to 239, and just a ton of stuff that came out. But anamorphic is something that survived and has lasted the test of time, primarily because it was easy. And we ended up with over 40,000 theaters that could project anamorphic by the end of the 1950s.
It's interesting, and we've talked about this as a sidebar. It's interesting, or I find interesting anyway, the sort of the geopolitical nature of optics and glass, and like where they're formed and started, and how that influences a region and their cinematic choices, from Europe to Asia to South America, to North America. What's interesting is I find like we are kind of subject to what is in our proximity, and I think there's an interesting kind of, I was talking about this with Jeremy the other day, where Jeremy Benning, where I find it hilarious that like how many music videos have been affected by just sort of, they want to shoot on something but they don't have the money to be able to get the lenses or the camera package that they want, that are now kind of like embedded in the lexicon of cinema, like that are just like that they are like go-to sort of visual staples or cues that we all know and love, but they were not the thing that they wanted in the beginning. Now there's like this wonderful saturation of like lenses and optics that like just democratized everything. But anamorphic is something that's interesting just because, Hollywood picked up the ball. 20th Century Fox picked up the ball with this anamorphic stuff. Where did it go from there? Like, who was the next in line that grabbed it?
Well, you mean beyond Hollywood? Who was next in line, or who was the next in line? Lens manufacturers.
Lens manufacturers.
The lens manufacturers, Panavision was next in line. Basically Bausch and Lomb were making the anamorphos and making the adapters, and then making the monoblock anamorphic lenses for 20th Century Fox and projectors. And then there was a gentleman by the name of Robert Gottschalk here in California who owned a camera shop and was also an avid diver, and had been experimenting with cylindrical lens elements to get a wider field of view underwater. And he had a client come into his shop who was talking about the problems of this new anamorphic format, and there were not enough lenses for the theaters. And he said, you know what? I know how to do that. I know exactly how to do that. And he formed Panavision. And Panavision's first foray was making projection lenses. There's so many the names, but it's Super Panatar, if I'm not mistaken. And then they forayed into making taking lenses, and wound up stealing the business from Bausch and Lomb by outperforming them, and in some cases literally taking Bausch and Lomb lenses and reconfiguring them into Panavision lenses. But there were a couple of significant problems that were happening. One of them is the mumps, and I don't know if that's a term that many people know. I mean, they might, but there was a problem as you focus to closer focus. The amount of compression in the anamorphot would reduce. So, at 15, 20 feet, you have a 2-time compression, but as you're focusing to 10 feet, 8 feet, that compression actually drops off and starts to go to 1.9 and 1.8, and you're losing some of that compression. And then when you take that image and you project it in the theater at a constant 2-time compression, that actor goes from normal to suddenly being recorded at 1.8 and projected at 2, and their face is ballooning as they're getting into close-up, and it looks like they've got the disease called the mumps. Panavision found a way to solve that problem. And they did that by incorporating rotating astigmatizers that are cylindrical elements that rotate counter to each other, so they can be complete opposite of each other where there's no compression, and then they can slowly add compression. And it does that as you closer focus, it compensates by adding more compression. And by doing this, they eliminated the mumps. And I'm going off in the history of this. This is not really what you asked about, but this
is the stuff that I selfishly love. There's some great questions here that I want to get to as well. But this is, like I said, these are fantastic answers.
So it actually it turns out that Frank Sinatra played a really significant role in Panavision becoming what they are. He was a 20th Century Fox actor, but he also, because of his power, worked with many other studios. And he had done some CinemaScope films and knew the problems. And one of the problems was you cannot focus closer than 5 feet. Absolutely, that was a flat out rule. No shot can be done closer than 5 feet. And then he went off to another studio, and he did a film with the Panavision Auto Panatars and fell in love with them and wound up doing, I think, 3 films back to back. And then came back to 20th Century Fox for his next film and said, nah, we're not doing CinemaScopes. We are doing Panavision on this. And because of his power as a star, Fox balked, and they were like, okay, we won't use our lenses and our system that we pioneered. We will go with this other system. And that was really the beginning of the downfall of the whole Bausch & Lomb and the CinemaScope and the rise of Panavision. I went way in the weeds there, but I do find it fascinating.
I love it because it's the historical aspect of it. It's funny how like a couple things like I find like celebrity, or in this case it was Blue Eyes there, but I find that like the NFL and the military are the two sort of factions that like literally push the limits of cinema, because the NFL is just like, let's see how crazy we can absolutely get with things. The big freeze, for example, is the first thing that comes up to me, or even the spider cam that they invented, because they're just like, how can we get in the face of the football player without actually touching the football player? So I'm always interested in like how things came to pass by virtue of just like, a necessity, or just like a flagrant kind of obscene waste of money, which is synonymous with the film industry. There's where was the question here?
Yeah, let's get to them. I'll stop riffing and answer some
No, no,
questions.
no, no, no. This is again, this is great because they just segue into some of these questions beautifully. This is a little bit of a tangent though, which is going back to sort of large format optics. Jeremy asked, will we see other manufacturers creating LPL mounts like the signature primes that have a shorter flange depth concept, better optical performance, less breathing in CA, or is it a simple patent matter with ARRI right now?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, what ARRI has done with the LPL is what they did with the PL, which is counter to most things that company does. In that when they introduced the PL mount in the 82 or 83, they made it open. Anybody can take the PL mount, and that made it a ubiquitous standard. ARRI introduced it and said anybody can do this, and it's out there, and they're doing the same thing with the LPL. The LPL is a smart mount. It not only decreases the flange, but it increases the throat size. And that allows for larger rear optics, which allows us to get more into centric optics, into faster lenses, and reducing the flange also gets us into improving optical design and simplifying optical design. We've spent 70 years or so struggling to deal with the flange depth of a rotating mirror in a reflex camera. The whole reason why we went to 52 millimeters is to get that reflex spinning mirror behind there. And now that we've moved in the digital world and we don't need that, we can really relax and kind of reduce that and get better performance and more custom performing lenses with that. And increasing that throat size to the LPL was a really smart move too. So, there's been a lot of other, the XPL and the Maxi PL and these other mounts that have been kind of floating around, but I think we're going to see the same thing happen with PL is a ubiquity of that, adopted by a lot of other lens manufacturers. No, I'm not going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, fair enough. It's the signature primes. What's interesting is like the signature primes and last time I touched the Ingenue Optima was at Cinegear in 2019 when people were actually allowed to see each other and touch things. These lenses, the Supreme primes, the signature primes that ARRI has created, these are magnesium housings that are just like, they feel considerably lighter. They weren't constrained, like, for example, this is a Cooke S4, but this thing is a 32 mil, and I think it's about just shy of like 4 pounds. But it's like a signature prime is like considerably lighter now than this, and a big part of it is because of magnesium housings. Do these lighter materials affect the performance of lenses or optics? And why can't they, for example, company or manufacturer like this go back to sort of refinishing some of their kind of exterior materials to kind of be able to play nicer with gimbals or be lighter? Is there a reason why companies won't revisit sort of older optics?
Cost.
Right.
It's purely cost. Yeah, no, there isn't any performance issue that comes with, say, magnesium to aluminum. It all comes down to cost and machinability. Magnesium is not an easy material to machine. Aluminum is. So just being able to tool up to make those magnesium housings for the signature primes was not an easy endeavor. But it was a really, really smart move. We could get into potentially carbon fiber designs. And that might be, kind of the next thing coming up is that we'll see a lot more high-end plastics or carbon fiber being worked into the mechanical elements, as long as they are still as robust and repeatable and temperature stable as our common metals are. When you get into talking about what affects performance, thermal aspects is huge. And the thermal tolerances of the materials chosen have to work synergistically with the thermal tolerances of the glass materials that are used. So if you have a glass element that expands faster than your metal, you're going to get hoop stress or shattering or all sorts of problems that might happen, cracking, delamination. And likewise, if your metal expands faster than your glass, then you'll get into loose elements or canted elements or tipped elements. So there's a real fine balance in what can be used and how those materials work together.
Right. The Arthur Cooper had a question here about pulling focus and no breathing, but there's no context to that question. I don't know if Arthur, you want to chime in and just sort of like ask a fully formed question there, sir? Or there was another one here.
We can make one up.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Where was this? I guess I'll ask this one was the speaking to the pandemic. Has that slowed any specific manufacturing down that you're kind of amiss about? Is there something that you were looking forward to seeing in the upcoming future, but now the pandemic has slowed our production down?
There's nothing that specifically comes to my mind. Like, oh man, I was really waiting for that to come out. The whole world stopped, so it wasn't a surprise that other things may have been slowed down. Yeah, nothing specifically comes to mind. I mean, I think that we're going to see the ripple effect of this pandemic for probably a good decade. In slowing down of products and slowing down of production and all sorts of things that I remember the effect of the Writers Guild strike, the first one that I ran into in my career, and watching the ripple effect of that strike literally last like a decade. Like you could see the slowdown of production and the lack of new production, and then suddenly a ramp up of new shows that came out 2 and 3 and 4 years later, all as effect of that one strike that happened in Hollywood in the 90s, early mid 90s.
Even the writers strike in 2001, the writers strike as well, 2002, and that kind of even slowed a lot of productions down as well.
There's been a couple.
Yeah, the where was I? I lost my note here. This is a young man, Dylan. Do you find that noticing micro differences between the lenses is something that takes time and experience to notice, like a wine taster and different wines? I'm just curious. I'm just learning and starting out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all experience. I'll kind of go anecdotally and make a little confession. Most of my career when I was shooting, which was pretty much from about 96 to 2006, in that range when I was a cinematographer, mostly working with DP. My lens knowledge at that time was Panavision Ultra Speeds and Panavision Super Speeds, and normal speeds, basically standard speeds. That's basically what I knew of the world. I knew that I couldn't afford the Primos. I almost never got them. I couldn't get the anamorphic, so that was pretty much what I knew. And I was a Panavision guy, and that was my knowledge. And then I was actually teaching a series of lectures that were sponsored by Panavision, and I was doing them at Panavision. And I got asked to do one of the lectures on lenses, and so I did this lecture, and then kind of talked about what I knew about lenses, talked about focal lengths and focusing and breathing and all of this fun stuff. And Guy McVicker, who was at the time the Panavision guru for Panavision Hollywood, the optical guru, sat in on that lecture, and it was really nice to me at the end of it. It was like, that was great, that was good. You want to come listen to what I do? I was like, yeah, man, for sure. And I called my buddy Chris. I was like, you got to come out. Let's do this thing with Guy. And Guy spent a day with us and blew our minds and showed us that we knew nothing. I knew nothing about optics. And we came back to Panavision and we spent several days there testing every 50mm lens that they had, based a lot on what Guy had taught us. And then I was learning to see spherical aberration and distortion, kind of new distortion, but really see distortion and see chromatic aberration and start to see characteristic of flare and understand the differentiation between veiling glare and spot flare and start to learn to see this. And that test is what spun Probst off into going down the roads of K35s and the idea of custom tuning the look of a job with the optics. And I'm really kind of embarrassed to say that most of my career, I never did that. And that was part of the impetus for writing this book, was realizing, okay, we're not alone. A lot of these cinematographers and even ASC members are pretty limited in their scope of understanding of optics. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. So let's take and find a way to do this. And, we spent 7 years now finding the way to do that, painfully.
Well, and there's a book coming out at the end of the year. I think me and all the guests here are going to hold your feet to the fire for that.
Please do.
I mean,
we said that 3 years ago too.
Every single ASC barbecue, I've sort of held you down. I'm like, so is it going to be this month? It's interesting because it's just like, I don't know. I mean, just as an observation, I mean, you're saying like 7-8 years ago that you felt that like it's one avenue that you didn't explore as a cinematographer. That's interesting because it's just like up until a certain point, even I would again argue like mid 2000s or until when Red really made its mark and really democratized like Super 35 filmmaking. I kind of feel that not a lot of people really focused on it because the game up until that point was to statistically get rid of imperfections because the negative was the characteristic. It used to be the film stock that used to be characteristic. I actually remember reading, I was super charmed by this article in the ASC that Dan had, Dan Mindell and Dan Sasaki, when ramping up to do the new Star Wars movies with J.J. Abrams, the old film stock didn't exist. So they actually found the lenses and the serial numbers that did the original Star Wars movies. They dusted them off, they figured it out. And then when they put them onto the film stocks of today, they were just completely different. Same lenses, completely new negative. It's going to turn out differently. And they spent like something to the tune of, I know I'm misspeaking here, but it's something like between 6 and 18 months where they were trying to find the prescription to dial those lenses to the negative because they still wanted to shoot film, to dial those lenses to match the characteristics of the old film, to bring that optical tactile feedback to their audience members. Like that was like a big JJ Dan Mindell kind of like pursuance. Like they really made it their purview to kind of just like, this is what we need to do, which again, I'm like super charmed by that aspect. So I don't think that it's weird that you say you didn't, I mean, like you weren't looking for that education of it because, we were busy sort of maybe studying film stocks or lighting and different types of light. And now it's even more overwhelming because just like kids growing up, they have like, my God, like just like lenses and like lighting and LEDs are coming out now and plasma lights are coming out, which is also crazy. I mean, they've been around for a while, but even to something like Micro Four Thirds, you know what I mean? It's so funny because it's just like from a personal experience, I always, the race is always like, let's get to the biggest, coolest thing in the world. Like what are the big dogs using? And I find that from a personal experience, like my bread and butter is tabletop. like whether it's food or toys or whatever, I've been forced into kind of rethinking my lens choices just on size, predicated on size. So a lot of the toys that we shoot are like this big, and it's like, this is the lens that we're shooting for it.
That's a great example. Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense. So actually, I had a really great friend and a director friend of mine called Zach Rainey Barker. He and I were just like, well, why can't we use a micro four thirds lens or a C mount C series lens? So I always make the joke that I own Kawa lenses, but they're C series lenses and they're like $500 each. I don't tell them the second part. I just tell them the first part that I own Kawas. But
the TV lady, right? The video.
That's right. And we sort of were able to we found like a camera, like a security camera that we were able to mount these C series lenses, these Kawas onto. And it got us down into the diameter size that we needed. And that emboldened us to be able to kind of dynamically move a camera a little bit better than the traditional things that existed out there. I mean, Jeremy, maybe you could bring up a skater scope, for example, or one of those Revolution lenses, just to maybe show somebody.
Yeah, we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, and you blew my mind with this concept of something, because I haven't encountered this before. I never really thought about the idea of scale of the physical lens to the subject, and especially the central point or the nodal point of the camera being so far removed. That was a really fascinating discussion. You taught me some pretty cool things there.
Which I don't believe, but but for example, like you could see all the pieces here. So this is, for example, all the gack that comes on a Revolution lens. And Jeremy, show that guy in action. It just says Revolution. Like, this is the monstrosity that you get with these lenses. Now, technically, an incredible crowning achievement, these things. But what's interesting is again, like, that's a master prime still at the front. It's not solving my problems for certain things. The other interesting thing here is, by virtue of going through mirrors, you're actually going through something like about 3 mirrors in this optic, which again, you're just destroying the integrity of like what the master prime is. So you're kind of almost forced to go into this like optically kind of perfect lens, because then you're distorting it so much. Also, the other thing that's happening here with these with the prisms is you're actually trading on the vertical scale of a focus chart. By virtue of like twisting and turning the mirrors, you're actually no longer using the way that the lens was intended. Like, as opposed to, I'm sure you've noticed in your sort of findings that it's like, you take a Super 35 lens, you twist it 90 degrees, it's going to have different properties in its widest aspect. So sure, the lens is also, pardon?
Meridional to sagittal performance. It varies, absolutely.
That's right. And it's just like, there's I guess the more simpler version of it. What's neat about this is that Preston can hold, they designed it with Preston, the follow focus unit, so that you can actually twist the front mirror 90 degree kind of like optic there, and it can correct on a Preston motor to keep the horizon level, which is actually really neat. But again, the problem is that even the diameter of that lens is about 60 mil. Just recently, there's something called a Laowa probe that came out, which I'm sure a lot of people know. The price point is right for a lot of people, and there it is right there. I mean, I think people can see how big a Laowa probe is. You know, it's given us an opportunity to find these kind of interesting, neat places to get a camera into, but you're still subjugated to kind of being very, very far away from the nodal point of the camera, which is a problem that we specifically had, right? We wanted to get closer. Jer, show me not that one, the Cutie Cars one. So this is really funny, because this is just like a $1,200 lens. This is like a Zuiko Micro Four Thirds lens. And that camera is a 1080p Blackmagic camera, but because of how close we can get to it and just the crispness and sharpness of that kind of Micro Four Thirds lens, we're able to resolve this incredible image. And because a lot of commercials are still distilled to like a 1080p format on YouTube or just televisions, people can't tell the difference because of the optical integrity that you have from being that close. With a Laowa, and there's another lens in particular that was really interesting, the Infinity Probe. Jeremy, bring that up. This was kind of cool. I think again, Zach found this lens. You could see in the monitor how close we are to that toy and what the lens offers. But this was an interesting thing of like the obscure that I went down into. This is a NASA microscope manufacturer that created this. A guy called Jay Margulies. And it's funny, he designed it and it operates sort of like a Fraser lens where it's like everything is in focus. But what's interesting is that it doesn't have a traditional iris, and it refers to something called a Nelson point. And that Nelson point is the optical peak performance of that lens. And the dial that you switch, I wish I had a better picture than this. The dial that you sort of, it's the equivalent of an iris dial, but as you dial that plus or minus what this Nelson point center is, you get either a luminance shift or a contrast shift, and it just completely makes it mushy. And of course, as filmmakers, you can't help yourself, so you use the lens in not the original intention it was designed for until you find your kind of like desired effect. But again, still one of the fundamental problems is like, and you can sort of toggle between this image and the other one. Everybody knows the size of a red. You can see that the lens there is like 7 inches. With that cutie cars spot that we have, the whole lens length is 7 inches. So it enabled us to kind of find like this dynamic approach to filming. Again, what I'm charmed by quite a bit is the amount of options that are there. And whenever I kind of like teach at my old alma mater, like Toronto Film School, and I do guest lectures and stuff like that, I'm like, just use anything, use a Coke bottle, because you can kind of like make something like really special. Like, don't go for the sort of stuff that's in the magazines, the crowning achievement stuff. I'm charmed by the kind of the esoteric, the stuff that nobody knows about. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It also kind of harkens back to, people saying, especially people on the internet saying, "Oh, that's a crap lens. You can't use that." I don't subscribe to that at all. Every lens has a job, and every lens has a role. And if we look at, the plastic lenses in, Polga cameras, they're beautiful. They can create some really beautiful images. So yeah, use what is the right tool for the job, not what you think is the best tool.
This
And
concept,
that's great stuff, man. We're throwing that stuff in the magazine because what you're talking about in there, I haven't seen anybody talk about it. And especially you kind of briefly brought it up with the Laowa, but that the idea of moving that nodal point of the camera so far away, so if you want to do a tip, it's like a 2-foot move of the camera to be able to get a tiny little degree of tip on it instead of.
Even this is getting us closer. I mean, I put an obnoxious lens on here just because of the splash. This is thanks to Keslow camera, actually, this Cooke anamorphic. And actually, we should give a shout out to Cooke because we're on Cooke Optics today, and I have brought a Cooke 40 mil special flare and then a 32 mil Cooke prime. And I own these guys, which I love them. I love the Cooke look. There's a nice plug there. Hopefully, I'll get a T-shirt out of that. I mean, like even the kind of, I mean, it's a little bit built up, but the Komodo has done interesting things because it's bringing you that box a little bit smaller, and you're able to kind of like put lenses closer and get that nodal point closer to your subject, and just have interesting different desired effects. This is a bit of a wild card, but the Canon just recently dropped a bit of a bombshell about patent pending a curved imager. How is that going to change the principles of optics?
Well, it's fascinating. Canada's not the first to do that. It's been discussed for a long time. There's a French manufacturer that's been working on a curved digital sensor for a number of years. And if anybody has ever shot with the disposable film cameras that came out in the 90s, those were, for many models of those cameras, they were a single meniscus plastic lens element that worked to create a great image because the pressure plate in that camera was curved. So you have this tiny little plastic single element lens, and because you're curving your imager, you get a reasonable image out of that, because a spherical lens wants to project a curved or spherical image. And we have to do so much in our optical design to push those edges further away from the center to flatten the plane. So yeah, the idea optically of creating a curved imager is pretty extraordinary to lead to really simplified optical design, but it also completely renders obsolete 150 years of lens making. So on that curved sensor, you wouldn't be able to use your S4s there, or your special flares, or ultra primes, or all these things. You'd only be able to have that as a custom system with simplified optics. So
would you not be able to sort of solve the problem as well, like, what people are doing with expanders, like IBE or sort of Duclos himself, like they just have
the way to induce Hetzfeld curve inside the lens, I suppose it's possible. I'm going to say sure. It's almost like putting a cylindrical element at the base. That's a simplified way to think about it. But yeah, I'm sure there's a way that you could do that. But again, like with an expander, you're adding additional glass. You have to make sure that you have the back focus distance in order to do that. You're changing the properties of that, and I could be wrong, but I don't see it becoming like the next big thing. It will probably wind up becoming the technology for cell phones and point and shoot, and mirrorless cameras that have their own enclosed system, their own lens system to go with that. That makes sense. But as far as permeating into our world, in my crystal ball, I don't foresee that becoming a thing.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, like, it's interesting, like, as even phone technology is better, like, I'm still blown away at iPhones. Just, I mean, 3 different optical lenses, but I mean, like, that's probably somewhere where it would actually benefit the most of, because everything would be smaller. You don't need as many groupings, like element groupings. So it's an interesting, it's just interesting how technologically you could advance something else. It's funny because it's like one of those things where it will apply, like a cell phone manufacturer might greatly benefit, and by virtue of it kind of being democratized to the masses, it might influence the industry, right? Such as the same sort of old age thing of like Betacam and VHS, right? That same whole thing. Or even you call it HD DVD and Blu-ray, right? Just Sony owned more titles and more of the market share. That's what ended up winning. HD DVD existed for years, and Windows is trying to say, like, we've had this technology for years, it's safer technology. And Sony's like, well, we own everything, so we're just gonna run the market.
Right.
What has been the most, in writing this book that you have with Chris, what has been the most challenging thing that you've had to face, sort of like trying to kind of get into this book, that whether even you didn't know and you had to find, or just be able to kind of research?
Everything. We kind of briefly mentioned earlier, like 3 years ago, we were saying, hey, yeah, we're going to finish this thing, or we're going to get it out, as we're really close. And I've joked several times now that I've said, if I had written this book alone, it would have been out 5 years ago, but it would have been about 1/8 of what it is now. And Chris has constantly pushed us to, we're going to include this, we're going to include this. And one of the biggest things that he wanted to do that I was not planning on doing is our biggest chapter in the book, which is the history and evolution of lenses, from the Pet's full portrait through to the Optimo primes. That's just the first recent thing that I can think of. But we have painstakingly researched this evolution, both through optical design and to profile and highlight optical designers, optomechanical designers, lens technicians. We don't really shine the spotlight on filmmakers as much as we write individual profiles to highlight those individuals. And there are times when we would literally spend a week or two of work and research to end up with a sentence or to end up verifying a date. So that section alone expanded us 2 years in the writing of this book to make sure that our history is right, to go through the patents, to go through all of the literature. I have twice now been through 100 years of American Cinematographer magazine, literally page by page, because what we learned from the ads in AC magazine and International Cinematographer is extraordinary. It's when was the product first announced? When did they first use this terminology? When did variable prime first come out? Oh, wow, look, F&B Seiko used this term before Zeiss came out with the variable prime lenses. And that amount of research has been extraordinary. Technically, from the confession a little earlier, we knew nothing when we started this. So we've had to ramp up the learning curve to, we're not physicists, we're not mathematicians, and we're certainly not lens designers, but to come up to a point where now we can talk about, building these illustrations, I am manually ray tracing in Photoshop these optical elements, and have gotten to a point now where I understand that. I was so super happy this week to be able to illustrate a variable diopter or focusing doublet concept. And that alone, to build this little simple illustration, was 2 weeks worth of more intensive research, testing, practical testing, laser optics testing, more research, tearing apart adapters to be able to say, this is how it works, and simplify it for a reader to understand in a single image. So the answer to your question is every damn thing.
Jeremy has this great diagram of the double Gauss lens sort of like tree. Yeah, put that up, Jeremy. I want people to see that, just sort of like the evolution. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. And this one, let me see this one. I can barely see that in here. There's a little bit of misattribution in some of these charts because a lot of people, okay, so this is going back to the original Gauss and then the double Gauss. And that looks like the planar, and yeah, okay, so that chart actually looks pretty good, but a lot of people jump to the triplet, the Cook triplet, within that kind of symmetrical line, and the planar and the triplet and the tessar are really close to each other, but it's interesting in the evolution there between Paul Rudolph's design and Dennis Taylor's designs. And how they dovetail. Now, that also was another incredibly annoying aspect of writing this book, is there's so much that we want to attribute to this is what came first. But it's damn near impossible, because there are simultaneous things that are, discoveries that are happening in different parts of the world. There are patents that are released before a product, patents that are released after a product, patents that are written for a product that was never released. So trying to really nail down that sort of evolution has been a bear. And to the best of our knowledge, blood, sweat, and tears, we think we got it right.
I'm sure there will be somebody on the internet to point you out and like troll you that you did. Actually, Chris Probst, I think like a week or two ago, posted a BNCR lens with like a bezel in it that he was trying to, for some reason, it looked like such a new backing. I thought it was somebody that just CNC'd it themselves to fit into a gate. That's what it looked like.
Man, these mount things are so frustrating. And that was something that he and I were going through all these components of these K35s that he had, rehoused, and he's got all of this guts left over. And, we know the BNCR mount, but suddenly several of these mounts not only had sort of a knife edge shaved flange, but also these very precise indentations or grooves at the base of the mount. And we're like, why? Wait a minute, what is this? What is this? This is adapted for something, and it's showing up on these wider focal length lenses. We still don't have a clear answer on it, but it obviously was done to modify to a particular camera, specifically with wider angles. So we're still trying to get to the bottom end of that variation of the BNCR mount. And it's just frustrating as hell.
I can imagine, like, it's like there's a young man here, I don't know who, Rockstar 2Rs 382 said, this book is going to be my everything once it's released. I kind of want to tell him get in line. But it's like when the whole K35 craze, when I started like hearing about them 3 or 4 years ago, I sort of got into wanting to learn more about them. And then it's just like I started learning about the thorium isotope, and that's when I checked out. I'm like, no, hard pass. Like, I don't want to get involved with this stuff. Like, it's just like, that seems too much. Like, again, I was interested in kind of like how some lenses were filled. Oh, I mean, like, maybe that's an interesting conversation. Like, why add kind of funky elements like this, whether it's like nitrogen filled lenses, right, or something like a thorium isotope? Why did manufacturers do something like that to optics of yore?
Well, for a very long time.
I'll see you in an hour, by the way.
Exactly. Go make a sandwich. We're gonna play on this subject for a little bit. Get yourself a drink. We're talking about going back into the 17th century. George Ravenscroft introduced lead into the composition of glass to make crystal glass. And what that introduction of lead did was to create the flint glass. It increased the refractive index. So they've been adding all sorts of things into the chemical composition of glass in order to change that refractive index and to change its dispersion qualities, how it deals with color. And one of the properties that was added from the 30s to the 70s was thorium oxide, which is an isotope that is, it's radioactive. I guess I don't want to geek out too much in that, but they added this radioactive isotope in to change the refractive index of the glass. And there's some Cook Speed Pancros and the K35s that contain these radioactive elements that literally you can put a Geiger counter to the lens and it will register. It's a relatively harmless amount of radioactivity. I think the kind of general thought is if you were to put your eye up to the lens, that's not a good thing. You don't necessarily want to look directly through the lens, but a day exposure to one of these lenses is about the same as taking a transcontinental flight or an X-ray at the dentist. But these properties were added into the chemical composition of glass to improve its qualities, to improve its refractive index, which allows us to make smaller optical elements that still have the same property, the same refractive property, to improve the dispersion quality so that we don't have to have additional elements to correct chromatic aberration or spherical aberration for that matter. So there's been a lot of things incorporated into glass, and that tends to be one of the more popular ones to talk about because it's scary.
Right.
Radioactive lenses.
There's an element of danger. And that's
yeah, right. It's kind of sexy. It's like, oh man, I want it. But the amount of radioactivity is so low that it's not even necessarily governed or restricted for people to own. It's not like, you know, having a piece of uranium-237 in your living room. I think I said that number right. I'm not sure. It sounded right.
We have fact checkers. We'll have people look into that. There was a story actually where a production company in Toronto was trying to import a set of K35s for their job, but it got stopped at the border because it triggered the radioactive warning because they were these specific K35s. I'm not going to mention who had rehoused them. They didn't do it well. And apparently it was it just triggered. I mean, like you said, it's a fraction and it's negligible to our day-to-day existence. It was just funny. It's because it triggered security to sort of like pull it aside and take a look at it.
Generally speaking, especially the glass surrounding those elements block the radioactivity from escaping the lens. So it's not hard to control it and mask it. The downside of it is that, and I may botch this a little bit, but I'm going to try to get it right, is that those isotopes, when they decay, create F centers within glass. So they bias the color of the glass by deteriorating it and turning it brown or yellow. And that's something that can happen over time with thoriated lenses, is that they start to take on a yellow or a brownish kind of a tobacco kind of color to them. That can be reversed through kind of extreme exposure to UV, which changes the F centers to C centers and reverses that coloration. But it takes time and it takes pretty extreme exposure to UV. Some people have recommended leaving them out in the sun. I do not recommend that. By the time that the UV that reaches us from the sun makes any change on that lens, you will have massive environmental damage from moisture condensation to all sorts of other crap happening to that lens. It's better to put it into a UV chamber.
Yeah. We've meandered back onto K35s now.
And nobody did it to us. Nobody did it.
No, it wasn't a question. It was, we fell into our goddamn selves. I will ask the question because a lot of people may or may not know this. There's two fun facts which I've actually heard you speak to before. Like one that I'd known and one that I didn't know actually. But one interesting fact, Barry Lyndon, everybody was super obsessed with Barry Lyndon about the Nikon 0.7 aperture, I believe was the lens. Yeah. And then, but that's only the candle it's seeing. Everything else in that movie is K35s.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people don't know. The other thing
also, if I remember correctly, or Ingenue, either Ingenue or Canon zoom. But yeah, K35 was basically, because it was a super fast lens, was the primary lens for that. But yeah, everybody talks about that NASA lens, the Zeiss F7.
Yeah, the f.7. And the other one is that not all K35s are K35s. And why don't you talk to them briefly about that? How it's filled in with other optics. Well, or at least
yeah, absolutely. It depends on what set you're getting. You know, the K35s grew out of Canon's still line. So Canon took their own still lenses and rehoused them for cinema use. So several of the focal lengths came from FD glass. that was purely repurposed and bumped straight into the K35 line. And then there were a couple of manipulations of those focal lengths. And then, if I remember correctly, Chris is the real expert when it comes to K35s, but there's the 35 mil was a custom designed K35. So there was not an equivalent 35 mil 1314 that existed in the Canon still line for decades. So that was custom. But yeah, you know, they're taking their own product and repurposing and releasing it. And a lot of K35 lens sets that you are renting are augmented by other focal lengths and other manufacturers. Chris is on a major rampage to kind of refine one of his 12,000 sets and get the perfect kind of combination. And he's reaching out to all sorts of different lenses to really fill in the holes, to expand the number of focal lengths. The original K35s were only 5 focal lengths, if I am remembering correctly, to expand that line with optics that match that look. And I can't reveal all the ones that he's pulling out or he will kill me.
Of course.
But yeah.
It's interesting, like, you know, there was this obsession with rehousing lenses when people, especially with the Leica series, people were getting obsessed over serial numbers and trying to get serial numbers that were like really close by. But the funny thing is that I've heard, you know, amongst you and Chris and other forums and stuff like that, that it's not the way to go about trying to match lens sets, because as you said, like some age differently, some were stored differently, they have decayed differently over time. So it's almost important, like, you know, test. And I think that's kind of important to know, to sort of share with any kind of like lens system, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also copy variation that you have to take into consideration. That's a pretty standard, pretty extreme, can be difference between serial number 7 and serial number 8. They don't necessarily match because of manufacturer specifications of the variances within copy variation. And, you know, but stories from the great rental houses, the Keslows and the Panavisions, of getting brand new lenses, and they will get 5 of them in and they will reject 4 of them because the copy variation does not match their expectations. So I'll send them back to the factory brand new. And then the factory's got to either send them new ones or tweak and fix and then come back. And then they will continue this process until they get the quality that they want. Some manufacturers are more prone to that than others.
I know Camera Assistant that when he was buying his stills primes, Canon stills primes and like the plastic housing, he would keep returning the lenses until he'd find one that's like parfocal, even though that's not what they're designed or intended to be. Like he would just keep sending it back until he found, I think he went through like 10 17 to 55s before. Like, I mean, there's $1,000 lens, but he just kept sending it back until he found one that kind of like met his parameters that he wanted, because it's like, you know, their tolerances are broader when it comes to sort of like DSLR type stuff over cinematic stuff. And you know, it's $1,000 versus $30,000, which is, you know, you're hoping that the $30,000 optic will perform technically better, not necessarily be better, but you're hoping that it's technically better. Scott's got an amazing question here, actually. Seeing the emergence of UV boxes for disinfecting equipment during the pandemic, is there a reason to worry about damaging lenses during the process of sanitization?
That's a really great question. As a matter of fact, the ASC had a committee dedicated to researching this, part of our future practices committee. They set a subcommittee on to looking into UV. I was involved with that, and a lot of other manufacturers, lens manufacturers, were involved with that. And the kind of final recommendation of practices is most lens material is relatively safe for exposure in UV, but we would recommend doing it with the lens caps on, especially when you're talking about things like Thoriad lenses. You can change the property of that lens by exposing it to UV. Now, a short exposure isn't really going to make a difference. But if you're like a rental house who is cycling these constantly and constant exposure, you can change the quality of that lens. There isn't necessarily a proven detrimental use or effect of UVC, but the problem is we don't naturally receive UVC in the world. It's filtered out by our atmosphere. So we don't know what it's going to do to plastics or rubbers or some, coatings. We're not entirely sure. So the recommendation is basically, if you're going to UV sterilize your equipment, your lenses, to put the lens caps on.
Are some materials prone to UV compared to, like for example, in now magnesium versus aluminum, for example?
We haven't had any evidence of metal being an issue, but plastic can definitely be affected. And even, a little bit superficially, but the dyes within plastic can be affected faster than something else. So you can get the cosmetic appearance of a particular product to degrade very quickly. But it also potentially could affect the structural integrity of some plastics. And there's a lot of questions that are still out there. That's pretty much what this committee determined is we're not entirely sure. We believe that it's pretty safe right now, but best bet is to kind of protect things. A lot of companies like Duclos were recommending, instead of UV, using isopropyl alcohol to sterilize, because we know that that's safe on optical materials. So, alcohol wipes will sanitize and deactivate any viruses, and still maintain safety for the optical and mechanical portions.
What about the mechanical properties of the lens? Like by getting into the gears or getting in between, sort of like, these aren't weather-proofed. Do you know what I mean? I know that you're not drowning it in alcohol, but
yeah, don't do that. Don't soak it or submerge it. Anytime you're talking about lenses and the term submerge, you're in trouble. But yeah, general wipes are not necessarily going to permeate. And the nice thing about alcohol is that it does evaporate quickly, so that even if it does necessarily seep in, potentially maybe affect the lubrications of the grease in a very slight way. But don't pour alcohol on it. Just a simple isopropyl alcohol wipe will deactivate the virus.
Christ, I can keep going on forever. Christina, how much time do we have left? Let me see.
It depends on if people are still here. Everybody left. They're like, oh my God.
That's right. If we haven't, yeah, we should. Jeremy's saying that we can wrap it up. I could sit here and just ask you a billion other questions. But Jay, is there anything else that you have to add? First of all, thank you for joining me with this. This has been like a personal treat, because it's just like I love talking about this stuff, and I can go on for days. And it's just nice to sort of hear some of the history and the wisdom. And I really can't wait for this book. It seems like it's shared with a lot of our guests today. Is there any final thoughts you got, Jay?
No, man, it's a pleasure. I can talk about this pretty much until I'm blue in the face. You don't go into a project like the Cine Lens Manual for monetary gain. You certainly don't go into it for advancing my career as a filmmaker. It's a passion. It's a passion of this subject and wanting to share information, and wanting to share what we've learned, and to try to create the definitive resource that just doesn't exist when it
comes to a personal question. This crushing amount of knowledge that you have and that you've sort of undertaken in the last 70 years, when you go on set now as a filmmaker, do you feel that whoever your cinematographer is, do you feel that, are you intimidating them when you're sort of just like on set with them, or it's just like, or do you find yourself just completely just, you've got cement shoes and it's just like you keep on being persnickety with each shot, or are you able to separate the two?
Totally. I've always been able to compartmentalize pretty well. I also, I know, having come up as an electrician and a gaffer and a cinematographer, I know what it's like to be micromanaged and to feel like you're just working from the neck down and you don't have any input. And I don't ever want to do that to somebody.
Right.
So what I have done personally in my career, and tangential, is I've always known I wanted to direct. And I have spent my entire career trying to learn every other job on the set, in addition to directing. So, I started as an actor, I've been a writer, I've been an editor, I've done visual effects, I've done graphic design, I've been a grip, I've been a production designer, I've been a script supervisor. I've done all of these jobs to understand how to communicate with people better. I just happen to have found a second passion in cinematography and lasted longer there than any other job. But to me, it's not that, Marty, you're going to come shoot for me and I'm going to tell you we're using this and we're using this and we're shooting with this. What it does, this knowledge base, for me, is it allows me to communicate better with you in your language. So to say, this is the look that I want to get. And if you run into a problem, I have a knowledge base to troubleshoot and help you with that. And to be like, well, we got too much flare here. Okay, let's stop down. I know the solution to that problem looking at the monitor if you're struggling with it. But I'm not going to be the guy who's going to be like, this has to be the 55 mil K35 because I want that onion ring bouquet in this scene. I might suggest that, but I'm not going to dictate to you what your job is. I'm just going to be able to communicate with you better.
Right.
What I want as a director.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna stop it right there. Jay, thank you very much for your time. What a great treat to have you on board. I just want to thank also Cook for hosting us and giving some of the fabulous lenses that we had here to sort of share. The book, I believe, is called CineLens Manual, is the working title right now. Everybody watching, thanks for watching. Next month's topic, we're going to be on mentoring. So please tune in, because the CSC is going to be doing a live event on mentoring. And also, if anybody wants to check out the old CSC lives, there's a wealth of them now. And today is actually our 1-year anniversary from when we started the CSC Live. So it's extra special for having you on board for that. So please go check out www.csc.ca in COM, I believe. And there's the cscstore.ca in COM for any other information and magazines. Actually, the CSC is offering a promo right now because of the pandemic. Our magazines are online free right now for whoever wants to sort of just share and get into that information. Jay, thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. Happy birthday to CSC Live. It's great to thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks. And my name is Martin Wojtunik. See you next time.